So next, let's really zoom in a bit here on mainframe modernization. Brent, I'm going to start with you in this regard. So how really are mainframe buyers buying?
So it really kind of depends on scale and how much infrastructure they have to support the mainframe environment. Smaller mainframe environments, I think they're tending to start to close down and try to move those workloads to cloud or other systems, just because they really don't have the internal infrastructure to support them and to hire the people and the skills they need in this market to keep it going. Those people are also looking at mainframe as a service hosting if they need to. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of interesting things happening from my perspective. And I just came from Open Mainframe Summit, which is sponsored by the Linux Foundation. And there's a number of projects to essentially unlock the data and services that are on the mainframe and kind of speed up velocity on the mainframe. So mainframe has this history or reputation of being slow and unchanging, right? And that was great, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where you didn't want those systems of record to be affected much by change. But we're in a position now where you need that data, you need it quickly, you need to be able to make changes quickly. Your customers expect you to be able to give your account information in seconds rather than the next day. And so there's been an effort to put in API layers and wrappers around mainframe systems. One big one is the Zoe project, which introduces an API-driven interface to the mainframe. Linux One and Linux on Z are making a big splash right now within the mainframe environment, allowing Linux to run on the same hardware as an IBM Z system. You get to take advantage of a lot of the speed and kind of co-location of your workloads that way. So what happens is there's a lot of innovation happening in that space, and it's really picked up over the last, say, year and a half. If you would have asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd be like, most people are moving stuff to cloud. They're asking about AWS. They're trying to figure out how to find an emulation layer for COBOL code that they can't rewrite right now. But now I'm actually seeing people investigate mainframe DevOps adoption, using systems to kind of really take those monolithic code bases and break them down into functional applications, pushing things into containers on Z-Linux and Linux One, looking at OpenShift or Rancher or Tanzu for orchestration. But at the same time, they're also looking at, okay, I'm opening this up and I'm starting to make all this data, this rich wealth of data that I've acquired as a company, available to all of these end user or front end applications in order to enhance the way I run my business, my user experience, and really kind of accelerate the value that they can bring to market.
It's really interesting to talk about sort of the two viewpoints or the two angles on mainframe, right? The more sort of tactical, the smaller piece, and then the place where innovation is happening. I think for a long time, as you said, mainframe really had a conventional wisdom that it was slow, you shouldn't touch it, it was really critical, what do we do with it? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that when you talk about mainframe, and we're doing it in this discussion, we're talking about mainframe applications and mainframe systems, and we're talking about mainframe hardware at the same time, and it's very difficult for those discussions to be separated. Mm-hmm. When we talk about what's happening in the innovation space, it's actually beginning to look like the separation of those things, right? Let's look at the hardware and what the hardware can do separately, and then let's disconnect that a little bit from the systems and see if we can sort of maximize the benefits of both so that they become more adaptive and resilient in that space. I think from a buyer perspective, though, we still do see a lot of sort of tactical buying. We see a lot of very technology-based initiatives, project buying, right? We see a lot of technology buyers telling us, not really focused on the innovation and the outcomes for modernization, but more on sort of interim steps. Get me off the hardware, get me off COBOL, let me have some sort of a different code base. And so we still see a lot of that, the mainframe discussion sort of dragged back into that tactical arena, I think.
Yeah. I definitely think that's true, and I think we're getting to this like inflection point. And I'll give you kind of two anonymized conversations that I've had. One was a bank that was starting to rebuild their mainframe infrastructure because they were getting some regulatory pressure to be able to rehost things that were in the cloud on-prem in the case of a cloud outage. And so they were looking, okay, how do I do that? So they had already done a whole bunch of modernization, moving stuff into different cloud providers, but then they had to deal with, okay, what happens if I have to deal with a cloud-based outage and transition those services quickly? So the platform they were building was a very modernized application environment on mainframe. At the same time, they were also asking questions about mainframe as a service vendors for COBOL code that they had no intention of ever modifying. It just had to run. And then they were also looking at SaaS-based services to deal with code that, there was a better product already in the market as a composable SaaS product that they could consume, and they would just reduce their MIPS consumption. And it was really an optimization process. They were using the platform in the way that it could best be used, rather than just kind of running an old workhorse that was developed, 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's the differentiated approach to buying that really begins to get interesting. And I think we see that with much larger mainframe portfolios. But when we think about mainframe modernization, a lot of people will talk about, well, how are we going to deconstruct the mainframe, or how are we going to deconstruct the systems? And that is a critical piece. Mm-hmm. But part of that is to deconstruct that for the buyer and help them understand, the mainframe is not it may be technically a monolith, but you're fulfilling a wide range of business functions. And how do you begin to think about those as a portfolio of systems, not just one system because it happens to be running on the mainframe?
Yeah, I think you guys bring up a pretty interesting point about, the extensibility of the logical aspects of mainframe services and mainframe platforms. And, there seemed to be, sort of to your point, Brent, earlier, there was this move away from thinking about the extensibility of mainframe into, let's just replatform this thing, right? And now we're sort of coming back to the discussion of, can you really strangle, encapsulate, and achieve these interim states of modernization with a mainframe service that still has a long shelf life? And I think this was another discussion that really sort of was on the crux of scope being a factor into whether or not that was a successful strategy to use. Because, strangle and encapsulating, a singular mainframe service that might not be doing, hundreds of thousands of MIPS, maybe 5 to 10,000 was a bit more salient of an approach. Maybe we can create some kind of an open API, distribute data to, our front-end web services, be able to give our customers access to data in new ways. Maybe that was a successful approach for a certain scope. But when you're talking about massive international mainframe operations, multiple hundred thousands of MIPS, maybe even getting into the millions, then it's like, the time and energy it would take to create a sophisticated API layer, would that time be better spent just working on the replatforming to begin with? So I think we are seeing, some of those discussions come into play with some of our clients who are really going through that process of, okay, we've had this piece of hardware and software in place for 30 to 40 years. We know it's not going to last forever, but what are our next immediate steps? And, in some ways, the innovation in this space is definitely, creating more optionality for our clients. And quite frankly, that's where they probably need a little bit more of that consultative strategy piece from a global service integrator to sort of outline what the benefits of each option tree would be and sort of help them understand the benefits of going one way versus the other. Yeah. And I think that's something that NTT has done fairly well, just because we have a lot of robust product leadership in this space, but we also have a lot of portfolio strategy leadership that sort of helps our customers really reconcile what their desired end state should be for mainframe hardware and software services.
Yeah, and to your point about like the replatforming decision, it's going to be a replatforming decision no matter what. Because even if you're modernizing mainframe to introduce these API layers and break apart your application, you're still doing the work of breaking apart those applications and introducing the API layers.
Right.
You're spending the money somewhere. So the business decision has to be, where does it make sense to run this workload?
Right.
Are there specific capabilities on the mainframe that I need to take advantage of for regulatory or compliance reasons, or even cost reasons? You know, people make this decision when they're deciding to put a workload on AWS versus Azure versus GCP versus on-premise, you know, VMware.
Right.
They need to make the same decision with regards to mainframe. It's not,
Right.
it's not different in that context. It's just another place to run a workload. So break down this idea that the mainframe technology portfolio is separate from your technology portfolio.
Right.
Like, and that's the part that I think is starting to like ring true now is, you know, for the workloads that have to stay there, they're like, we're gonna manage these the same way we manage other workloads. How do we get there?
Right.
For the people that don't need the capabilities the mainframe brings along, they should probably be looking at other platforms, right? And there's gonna be a lot of interim steps along the way to get there. But the decision should be about what capabilities does this particular ecosystem bring that the actual workload needs. And you're making that same decision no matter where you put the platform. And this is where a GSI that has like a lot of partners, a lot of expertise, makes a lot of sense because you may not be able to compare those options if the only thing in your environment is mainframe and you don't know anything about the other environments.
Yeah, we see a lot of clients talking to us about making, you know, what is the move for the mainframe? What is the, you know, what's the thing? What's the R that we're going to pick for modernization for the mainframe? When really the, you know, your mainframe portfolio has to undergo continuous modernization in the same way that the rest of your portfolio has to do that, right? You have to really build that into what's happening. And so when we think about, you know, when we think about interim states, you know, the mainframe is fairly far away in its traditional classic legacy sense. It's about as far away as you get from the modernization outcomes that we've described. Right. So what we think about when talking to people about the mainframe is, let's talk about your interim states because that tends to be where clients will start. But let's get you to a productive interim state as soon as possible. Let's get you to a productive interim state where you can actually begin to exercise that continuous modernization program for whatever dispositions that you'll pull in for your mainframe systems. And for us, a lot of times that means replatforming. And we've actually done a lot of work with, I mean, our own replatforming platform, right? UniKix rehosting suite is really aimed at not just allowing the replatforming to happen and to separate you from mainframe hardware, but also to create an interim state where, you know, you've simplified your environment, where you have interoperability in different ways, where you can begin to make different kinds of modernization decisions more easily because you've done the replatforming.
Mm-hmm. You know, one other trend in this sort of domain of expertise that I've sort of noticed is I would consider the replatforming of mainframe to be a high-hanging fruit in the sense that it's something that cloud service providers, they didn't look at that in the early 2000s and even in the, you know, the next decade after. It's something that they've sort of been coming back to, right? Now you're starting to see cloud service providers offer hybrid models for mainframe. You know, they're just trying to cannibalize as much of that service market as they possibly can. They're saying, you know, don't do your tape disk backups for, you know, all your mainframe instances on-prem. We'll take some of those backups off of your shoulders so that you can focus on the transactional throughput. If that's, you know, where your delta, where your business differentiator is being driven, we'll handle the backups. And then you don't have to worry about a catastrophic failure affecting, you know, your potential for disaster recovery and, you know, continuity of operations planning.
Well, I think it's just what you said, Brent. You know, the innovation in the mainframe space over the last couple of years has really, really exploded and come to the front. And that means not just innovation around mainframe, but reconsidering modernization options for the mainframe that clients wouldn't have considered before. So the renewed attention from hyperscalers on mainframe modernization and moving those workloads to the cloud is, I think, part of that, right? Everything is new again. Everything is on the table again when it comes to mainframe.
So we keep touching on a few different terms that I'm hearing, right? Hybrid, productive interim states, continuous modernization, right? And Brent, some of the things that we've all been saying make me start to feel like mainframe modernization might be an out-of-date term, or at least doesn't really apply any longer, right? So maybe let's dig in a little bit to where we see mainframe modernization, or are we going to call it hybrid modernization? Like, what are we going to call it in the future? And where is it evolving? You've all touched on some of this so far, but where is it? Let's try to be succinct here. Where do you see this going? Do you see leaders in this space addressing that continuous modernization now? Let's start there, and then we'll maybe talk, Glenn, a little bit about how you think NTT Data is addressing that evolution of modernization.
Yeah, so I think like the term mainframe modernization has been colloquially meant moving to the cloud, right? And that's not the whole story anymore. I don't know if it was ever really the whole story. But I tend to talk to clients about it as optimization of workloads on the mainframe. And that's not as kind of a catchy term, right? But it really kind of captures what's actually happening. Some things are going to cloud. Some things are staying on mainframe as they were. Some things are moving to hosting services. Some things are being put into a modern development environment. Some things are migrating on the same hardware but to Linux, so they can take advantage of containers and orchestration. So it's like there's many paths that are happening, and it's really an optimization function. But ultimately, I think what the driver here is to build a framework where continuous modernization can happen. Because the traditional way that the mainframe was set up was to not be modernized, like at least the code base. Like COBOL was meant to be hardware independent. It can be run unchanged no matter what happened with the underlying hardware. In some ways, not that different than when you think of containers and Kubernetes, right? But the problem is, because of that, those workloads were so embedded into business processes, people didn't touch them. They didn't make the changes necessary to keep up to date with business needs. And so they weren't addressing, that application code modernization layer to the point where there was a huge delta from the point where that code was really valuable to the point where we are today. So then suddenly, an off-the-shelf like SaaS CRM now competes with this very expensive application that's running on the mainframe that you're relicensing every 2 years. And if you look at like the benchmarks around mainframe, it's like half the cost in mainframe is around the software that you run on it. So looking at that code base and the applications you're running is where the low-hanging fruit is. And doing the hard work of breaking down your mainframe portfolio and figuring out, does it make sense to run it here? And if it doesn't, finding the place where it makes sense is the important part.
Yeah, sounds like it's vital to do that sort of front-end consulting, discovery, assessment, rationalization work.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, like, to IBM's credit, they're actually making more things attractive for running on the mainframe. Like, so there's Z16, for instance. Like, they have this AI accelerator on it, so you can run AI models on your mainframe. If you're thinking of like, fraud detection or something, traditionally what would happen is a credit card processor would take in the transaction, and the latency of sending that fraud model to the cloud, getting it stored and coming back, meant they could only score like 10% of the transactions. And if you're doing it in platform, you can score all of them. So there are use cases that, they might end up moving to mainframe instead of off. And it's on, IBM and the platform software vendors to really kind of build that additional capability. But I think what happened is, for a long time, there wasn't a whole lot of like front-end innovation. There weren't a lot of things that were driving revenue with regards to innovation on the mainframe. And that's, I think, flipped recently.
You mentioned mainframe modernization at one point was just sort of, move it to the cloud. And I think, even before that, before that, people were talking about that, and it wasn't that long ago where nobody was talking about moving the mainframe to the cloud.
Yeah.
It was about how do you get rid of the mainframe, or how do you take your applications and just get something else, right? It was sort of synonymous, and that was such a big, sort of bite to take that it was prohibitive, and so nobody went anywhere, and that reinforced the idea that you just don't touch it, you don't do anything with it. And so, being able to sort of shake that loose. Yes, we can move you to the cloud right away. Yes, we can do all that. But the real key is the deconstruction, because COBOL applications, which is still the primary code base for mainframe applications, is a liability at this point, right? There's a real skill deficit for COBOL, and clients are feeling it, and they're worried about it. So doing something different with the applications and being able to modernize those just at a code base level is sort of almost a workforce transformation table stakes, right? To be able to do some of that. And so when we think about getting to a state where a productive interim state, being on the cloud is a more productive interim state than not being on the cloud. Being able to, having a simplified environment where what's happening in the environment that is maintainable and supportable is a productive interim state. And for a lot of mainframe, environments, that's a real problem. These applications are 30 years old. The people who wrote them, the people who really understand them, are long gone, and so it's a real problem to have to rediscover that. When we think about what we do within our own Nucleus platform, we talk about the Application Transformation Suite and our ability to sort of build a foundation of discovery. And what we're really trying to do there is pull out, first of all, what is the application doing, and what's the value of the application? Because if we can work with clients around the core value, right? We mentioned some of these COBOL applications were at one point tremendously valuable. They still are to different degrees and in different ways, right? There's value embedded in them. How do we pull that out? So our ability to analyze those applications, to extract value, to give a business view of what the application is doing, begins to create that productive interim state where you can actually talk about modernizing a business function versus modernizing the COBOL or modernizing the hardware.
Yeah, quite frankly, I think no one really expected us to be where we are today 20 years ago. Like, if you took a poll of global CTOs who are operating in some kind of mainframe environment 20 years ago and asked them if they thought they would still be on mainframe in 2022 going into 2023, I'd venture to reckon at least half of them to maybe the majority would have said, no way, right? And here we are talking about extensibility of mainframe. Here we are looking at, the global operating environment where, 80% of the top 50 banks around the world still have some level of mainframe operations, where, 10 out of 10 global insurers, the largest insurers in the world, are still using mainframe. And let's not even get into the public services discussion. There's just tons and tons of mainframe still being used, which is why you see this pivot in innovation within mainframe modernization. You see this pivot with hyperscalers looking at ways that they can embrace and adopt mainframe services within their service mesh, within their fabric of operations. And really, there's a few major patterns that are sort of stimulating growth in hybrid mainframe services. We talked about APIs, creating that extensibility for front-end services to use mainframe data. We talked about, data storage and recoverability being moved to the cloud away from mainframe. But there's actually a couple of additional motions. Some of them are heterogeneous orchestration software. Sort of to your point, Brent, earlier about how can we adopt a DevOps or Agile framework for our mainframe services and software development. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of cloud service providers that are offering frameworks that allow you to build, implement, deploy across very distributed hybrid environments, and that's also sort of increasing the appetite for maintaining long-term mainframe operations. So we are sort of in this conundrum of we're not where we thought we'd be, right. But because we are where we are, there's a lot more options available to clients, to service providers, and we're really in the process of helping our clients distill the best way forward as they approach the maybe topic of mainframe modernization, or maybe it deserves a better title than that.
Do you mind if I just kind of ask a
please.
question? So so I'm seeing that too, like the proliferation of options to deal with there's a new management tool every day, right? And everyone wants to be able to manage all the environments. As a partner that's working with a business and helping them rationalize that environment, how do you choose? How do you help them choose which ones to standardize on?
Personally, sometimes it does come down to, is your client anchored in a specific service framework, or do they have a certain set of software that, they have maybe 10 years of licensing already under the books, and they're sort of, cemented to that deep base of technology leadership within their company, so they know they have the labor, the skills, the workforce to support that kind of operations. It's very hard for a service integrator to come into a client environment and say, hey, by the way, this entire subset of your staff is irrelevant, and by the way, you should hire this one. So, so there is definitely a little bit of sunk cost in terms of when you walk into a client environment, what are their licensing models, what are their pre-purchased hardware, what is their depreciation and CapEx model around what they've already bought. So there's some level of reconciling that. And then there's some level of just really having the domain and industry level expertise to say, hey, AWS's hybrid deployment and orchestration service pipeline is a lot better than Azure's for this kind of mainframe service. So having the right skill, the right staff, the right consulting to really be able to guide our client partners through their transformation journey is also another part of that. I feel like you're probably itching to say something.
As close as you are to our clients.
It's reasonable. I mean, some of it's commodity, right? So that gravitational pull that exists already at a client site will decide that. I think that makes sense. But I think when you mentioned the industry consulting, I think that's really, really critical. So part of it can be, here's some standards in the industry, here's some best practices in the industry. That's a very reasonable sort of consulting approach to take. But where I think we try to go a little bit further is to try to really work with customers on what they see as commodity for their own business, what they see as their own intellectual property, and based on that, what should you be doing differently in order to monitor and manage what you have going on, and how do we help to elevate the things that you feel are IP within your own business so that they get the most attention? So I think there are a couple layers of that. If we go a little higher, gravity is important.
Honestly, I think it really leads itself well into something that we've been taking to market, which is a really value stream based consultative discussion around portfolio optimization and modernization. If you really, sort of to Glenn's point, have the ability to identify which parts of the mainframe services and software that you're using are truly differentiating for your business versus which are commoditized, then you really have the ability to manage that value stream and that product long term. And so really separating the two is one of the most important things you can do as a service integrator, as a consulting partner to a lot of our client businesses.
And for sure, we invest in our own tools, right? We invest in our own IP, we invest in development. Our Nucleus platform is the key area for that, right? Is there a platform for management of a portfolio and for management of the business and for identifying sort of technical debt? Sure. And how much AI are we able to put into that? And how are we able to really drive automation with that? And so what we're looking for with our own Nucleus platform is how do we drive a different kind of value into that overall management that may not exist in the market, right? Where are the gaps that we can fill in?
I want to come back to something that you've all sort of touched on, bit of an elephant in the room and an elephant in everyone's room at this point, and that's talent, hiring, retention, so on and so forth. Brent, I'd like to ask you, how difficult is it at this point to staff experienced and knowledgeable folks in this new modernization space?
So I was actually working on a report about a year and a half ago where one of the subsections was talking about staffing concerns within the mainframe industry. And it was an update of an earlier report. So in the earlier report, it was talking about how businesses were having a really hard time finding COBOL talent. And when I went out to the market and started talking, that was less of a concern. But that was because you started to see COBOL boot camps. You started to see some colleges actually teaching COBOL within their environment. So you were getting some traction there. But the problem was that they weren't experienced developers. These aren't people that can look at a mainframe and be like, oh, I know how to deal with that code. Like, so there's going to be some like time in the market before those professionals get to the point that's needed to do the work that you guys are talking about. The other side of that is a bank that I was talking to was trying to get their DevOps developers to come work on the mainframe, and no one would touch it. They did not want to be viewed as a mainframe developer career-wise. Mm-hmm. So then they started introducing things like API layers and stuff, so those developers could actually write code in Python or whatever and pull stuff from the mainframe, and then they were fine. They were happy. So like there's a couple of things that are happening to alleviate the skills problems, but I think that big domain knowledge issue is still missing because those people are graduating out of the workforce.
Yeah.
And you really have to have people that understand modern services as well as mainframe in order to decompose this monolith. Because you have to understand like what people were thinking or doing in order to write that application in the first place, and then figure out, how do I take this million-line application and turn it into a bunch of little applications or microservices? How do I move this to containers? What part of this can move to a composable SaaS that I can like query via API? Yeah. And that's where you have to kind of have a team of expertise to look at this. And almost no enterprise has that team on staff, and they need to kind of reach out to the market for it.
Yeah, we talk to our clients about workforce transformation, the modern workforce, training them, innovation, automation, and we live that, right? We do the same thing for our own folks, but finding people who can think in that mindset and also can understand what's happening in a massive COBOL application is critical. Totally agree. We can teach people COBOL. We can teach people COBOL syntax and how to work in COBOL very, very quickly and easily. But the level of sophistication that's been built into these mainframe systems over the last few decades is unbelievable. And having people who really understand how those COBOL applications are being made to really jump through all kinds of obstacles and hoops, and how that could translate into a modern architecture, a modern system, is difficult to find. It's quite rare. We're extremely, our migration team that supports our UniKix implementations is we think is best in class. We're very proud of it, but these are very rare resources, right? These are extremely high-skilled folks.
Yeah, just 2 quick points on some of the topics you guys mentioned. You know, realistically, there's 2 things going on. One of them is, you know, it's probably easy to write something like Hello World in COBOL versus...
I think it's just print Hello World.
Right. Versus deconstruct an application that's being developed for 30 years with probably low amounts of documentation. And I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever had to, you know, debug an application with bad comments, you know how that goes. And imagine doing it in COBOL on something that was written 40 years ago.
I don't know if they have comments in COBOL.
Yeah, right. So there you go. And hopefully they have some documentation somewhere, but maybe not. So, you know, there's a big delta between being a junior developer in mainframe services and software and being someone who really knows this stuff in and out. And then second of all, you touched on this, Brent. You ask any developer on the market right now, their skill set is the #1 thing they keep an eye on. They don't want to be, you know, pigeonholed into doing legacy services, into doing something that's not market relevant, into working on not the latest code bases and not the latest libraries and software frameworks. To them, that's a death sentence in their career. So it's really hard to motivate young developers to learn legacy software. It's, you know, we do it, we try, and, you know, in some cases, maybe even universities are proponents for it. But realistically, for someone on their career trajectory, it's a hard thing to stomach. So those are just 2 really pragmatic factors that drive some of the challenges around this workforce transformation topic.
Yeah, great points, guys. I think next we'll dig into a little bit more around how GSIs are addressing this, how NTT Data is addressing it, of course, and talk a little bit about partner ecosystems and maybe even how to measure this value we keep talking about.